Hi everyone. I've met some of you before on a couple of these training courses. I am also a program officer in the Business and Biodiversity team, but my background is as a geologist. So I've spent the last few years working in oil and gas up in Scotland, and joined the team only a few months ago now, so back in March. So I'm still relatively new to the team, but it's been great. And in the team, I'm going to be focusing on natural capital assessments. So I think you have a session of that coming up in a few weeks' time, but I'm here today to help with the business engagement side. So it's good to see you all again. But to start the presentation, the first thing we need to do when you're trying to make your research business relevant is understanding your audience. So on this slide, we've got the 4 sections that we believe are almost like the key areas of business in terms of development and infrastructure programs. So your first one is your project proponent, which is your probably private company, your organizers of the infrastructure. So you want to identify who's in charge basically, and who's going to be doing all the organizing of the project. So it's normally a private company or a public company, or sometimes partnerships between governments and private companies. And they can be national or international. So you've got a wide range of companies that could be your project proponents, but they could be your major oil company or mining company or infrastructure developer. So these are your key company, and that kind of sits in the middle of your project bubble. And then as Sylvain went through earlier, you've got the regulators that start your process. So any restrictions or areas that they need to be aware of, that's when the regulators come in, and they are able to influence the project proponent on a higher level. So they sit slightly above, and the influence goes downwards towards the project proponent. And then you've got your lenders, so particularly your financial institutions, your investors, your banks that may influence the project and where you get your money from. And again, these can be private or public banks, and they can be national or international. So again, there's quite a wide variety of audiences and different levels that you're going to have to go through. But in general, these are the key areas. And then lastly, as we kind of touched on earlier, you have your civil society. So Sylvain mentioned the importance of getting public participation, and this is where we're talking about your civil society influence. So you can get your communities involved, particularly interested parties in terms of particular groups of people that have a strong interest in that area, or maybe they just really care about an area or the biodiversity in this bubble. So there's lots of different civil society components that you can look into. And then you've got your NGOs, so the more structured civil society bodies that can help influence the project and maybe be involved in a slightly different way to your communities, and maybe bring in some different elements of like the NGO bubble and bring it all together. So these are your 4 main audiences, but then you really need to know kind of how they interact, and this is quite a simplistic slide of interactions, but in general you can start to see through the arrows where the interactions occur. So the EIA landscape kind of sits in a big bubble of sphere around the project. So your project proponent sits in the center largely, and they're the ones that are in charge of like organizing the suppliers and consultants and the contractors. So the influence largely goes outwards from them to the people they are hiring, and that your influence is going to impact how you interact with them, and whether you need to identify how much they can actually do in terms of the project. But then on the higher level, you've got your civil society, your lenders, and your regulators that all have interactions that go towards the project, towards your project proponent company. And again, you can start bringing in your research to all these different audiences to try and influence it in different ways. And then you can see from the arrows as well, your civil society has quite a wide sphere of influence, and we're going to talk about this on the next slide. But in terms of influence, you can start interacting with different audiences in different ways to make sure that your research reaches as wide as possible, But the civil society doesn't just interact with the project proponent, it also goes towards the regulators and the lenders, and to some degree also your consultants, constructors and suppliers. So you can start to influence company values based on your research. But yeah, this is obviously a very simplistic slide. There are so many interactions going on around projects. But in general, you can start to see where the actors are coming into play. And the reason this is important is to determine where the influence is. So you need to, in terms of communicating your research, you need to know where you're trying to build your influence and who are you trying to target to get your research to be infiltrated into the business sphere and the decision-making processes of businesses. So you need to determine who has the influence, and in the broadest scheme, I think the typical audience is your project proponent, because they're the ones that are in charge of all the hiring and organisation. So they are pretty key audiences and have quite a lot of influence. But obviously all the other actors that we've spoken about so far are able to influence in different ways. So in terms of business influence, you have three main areas. You have your policy influence, that can be either internal policies or external policies. So you can have your large government policies that are able to guide some of the legislation and restrictions and obviously opportunities for companies. But you also have the moral and almost social influence on the companies, because they want to make sure that they are seen in quite a positive light and are seen to be playing their part in whatever project they are doing. So you can have influence in many different ways, but the key one for businesses, and often the hardest one in terms of biodiversity, is the financial influence. And this is where a lot of work is going on in the moment. And I know you're having a session on natural capital assessments later on, which I think will draw on this a little bit more. But in terms of financial influence, and getting your lenders and the financial body around the project to really start to guide and influence how the projects run based on their values, or where they are willing to put their money by setting their own bubble of influence. So there's lots of different ways, and everyone has a different influence in different areas of the project. So it's really key when starting your research to identify where you want your influence to go. So if you want to maybe start getting biodiversity into the decision-making process, can you start interacting with the lenders and restricting the amount of money to a particular project until it's got a biodiversity policy in place or something? So really targeting and deciding really early in your research process where you want to influence, and in terms of communication as well. Just deciding where you want that to come from is really going to be crucial. Then before you start your research, so we touched on this again, but this two-way engagement between the businesses. So obviously if the research is started, you can do this at any point of it, but getting the businesses involved as soon as possible, hopefully at the proposal stage of your research, really helps to get them engaged, because it opens a pathway for two-way communication. So it's not just you doing the research and telling them the results. You can start to integrate what you want to find out with what they want to know. So you get this open communication pathway that can make sure your research addresses the questions of the business. So do they want to know a baseline, as Sylvain said later? Is that what they're missing? Is that something that you can really help with? Or have they got a wider sphere? Do they not know anything about the biodiversity? What are their particular questions that they want to get from your research? And this allows them to get invested from a really early stage on in your research, and helps you as well, because it will help guide where your research may go to make sure it does have the impact you want it to have on businesses. And this collaboration is what we really want to start seeing a little bit more of in the business. So we want to start getting businesses involved in research, not because the research particularly is missing that influence, but we really think that this double two-way collaboration will really help just help address some of the key sustainability challenges that businesses may have. And the outcome of this is hopefully that all stakeholders, so all of the actors and audiences that we spoke about earlier, will start to recognise and value the benefits of their research, of your research, whatever part of the research you want to get across to them. It really helps to build in this value of different parts of your research. And it's not always possible. So sometimes the research already started or you're quite far down the line, and that's obviously not a problem at all. It's just a way to open a pathway and just get them involved as soon as possible so you can start to guide the way your research goes as well. And the earlier the engagement, the more specific your research can be to addressing the needs of the company. So we're not saying you have to change your research questions, but there might be a slight area that they're more important, that they give more importance to, that could just help guide if you just go off on a slight tangent to look into something slightly more specific to them. And also it opens a new way of expertise. So they'll have very different views on the project or the biodiversity that you may not have thought of. So it can be a really valuable exercise to go through in terms of building this relationship and starting to take lots of different audiences into account in your research. So in terms of research communication, it's really important to know how your research is going on, and your corporate decision makers will be quite restricted in the way that they can interact with your research. So it's quite common that your decision makers are time limited, so they may not have the time to commit to reading large papers or attending long presentations. They're widely influenced, which means that they have a lot of different aspects that they have to take into account. They may be a global corporation, it may not be the same all the way around the world. So you need to make sure that you need to be aware that they will have different influences coming from different parts of the project. And also that their expertise will be very different from yours. And this is absolutely not a bad thing. It can be very valuable in terms of bringing in different areas of expertise into your research. And also they're going to be action and result driven. So they may have very tight deadlines to get policy or biodiversity into their decision making. And it may be on a very strict timeline. So they may have very specific targets and very short deadlines for you to get involved in. And you just have to know about them, otherwise you can't address them. So it's just a case of being aware of the challenges that they face when they're trying to incorporate your research. And the other thing to note is that they are potentially politically affiliated and personally invested, which means that they may have influences that you aren't aware of, in terms of they may really care about the environment, or they may really care about a particular community or society. They will have their own personal investments that they want to make sure are captured. So they may have slightly different views to you, and it's just important to be aware. It's just important to be aware of this when you're communicating your research, and making sure that your research doesn't discount their views in any way, but incorporates them and makes it easier to communicate. So first off, to start doing research communication, and again, I'm sure you guys have tried a lot of this throughout your research, so please do let us know if you have any questions that you'd like to add to this list. It's by no means extensive, or there's loads of questions you should be asking, but these are the ones that we've identified as the key ones. So to get your research to the business sphere, you need to be targeting the right audience, and you need to determine what defines that audience. Are they the consultants? Are they project proponents? Are they the organizers? And what can really drive them? Are they economically invested, or are they morally invested in different ways? So you have to determine what defines them. And then you have to identify what matters to them. So what can you motivate them with? Are they particularly invested in so mining companies will have very different motivations to maybe an oil and gas or an infrastructure company. So making sure that you've identified their motivations and their interests as well. And you can do this through various ways that we'll touch on a little bit later. And then you need to identify where and when you can reach them. So is it going directly to CEO? Are there other key people that you need to be talking to or getting involved in the process? And what are the key messages that you need them to understand? A lot of them won't have technical expertise in your area. So you need to determine what you particularly want them to understand, and determine how are they interacting with us. I know earlier we had a discussion about maybe the lack of interactions between different bodies. So just working out how their interaction, are they just going along to presentations? Are they sitting in board meetings? Are they actually reaching out in any way to bodies around them to try find answers? So determining their interactions will be a really good question for you to go around your research on. So a couple of basic do's and don'ts for research for business audiences. And again, this is not conclusive, this list. I'm sure you guys have lots of experience and can add to this list. But what you really want to do is bring your passion. So people react to people, and the more you can show that you care and why you care, why is it important, not just to you personally, but to wider society. And being really enthusiastic is always a good place to start. But also you need to be ready to listen. So a lot of research is done in a one-way communication where you say, this is what I've found out. You need to listen to me. But instead turning that around and saying, can we listen to you? What is your experience in this sphere? Can you help my research? Is really important. And definitely in terms of presenting your research in a wider context. So as we spoke about just before the break, this interaction between society and environment and governance, they all interact so much, and the trade-offs between each of the environment, the society and governance are really hard balances to get. So you have to show how your research can maybe address more than one problem, and how it can create a sphere of problem solving that's not just one problem driven. And then we are looking at how your solutions are proportionate to the problem. So if something is small, show how it's bigger, how it relates to a bigger change. So one of the key discussions going on at the moment is about pollinators around the world. And that may seem like a very small problem if you're talking about a specific orchard, but putting it into the bigger picture and how it changes crop varieties or your farming outputs for the whole year is really important. So just showing how your research title may be a very specific problem, but it may actually have a wider context that you just need to be involved in. So in terms of don'ts, there's lots of these, but the key ones that we've picked out are: don't focus on the negatives. It's very easy to portray biodiversity, and particularly biodiversity loss, in quite a negative light and really show how it's detrimental, but actually flipping that conversation and trying to come across with a positive exchange can really help engage your business. But it's also important not to ignore the problems or the solutions. So you need to be having an open dialogue which addresses problems and solutions hand in hand. You can't just say, I have the solution to all of your biodiversity problems on this project. You have to identify where the problem's coming from in the first place. And a lot of you will have heard of this already, I'm sure, but the use of technical language can be a real big barrier to communication. The biodiversity in particular, I'm not from a biodiversity background and relatively new. There are so many acronyms and so many technical words that come across that unless you're an expert in the area, you just don't know about. So simplifying that language and trying to make it relatable and easy to pick up for everyone involved. And businesses won't, particularly CEOs and some of the high levels, they probably won't have a biodiversity knowledge base. So it's really important to be communicating your research in a way that is very easy to understand for non-technical audiences. And finally, this portraying your work as the lone superhero. It's what that means is that you don't have to make your research the conclusive solution to a particular problem, because in reality it's going to be interactive. There's going to be other links that you need to draw in. So showing, again, going back to the point we made earlier of this wider context and how your work is helping their work, or how, you know, this other body is doing research in a slightly different way, which can feed into your work and ultimately come up with a solution instead of just your work being the solution, is just a really good way of opening communication. So I'm hoping we will get a poll going in a minute, and I'm hoping to get Amaya's help with that. But on this next slide, we've sent these slides around, so I'm not going to focus on this too much. But this key message of being positive rather than negative, and showing that solutions are possible, and how that businesses can engage with positive messages has just been shown to be a lot more wide-reaching than if you just focus on the negative. So if you start to portray this idea that the problem is too big to be, or it's too late to find a solution, that is often quite a negative way to get an engagement process. So you want to be portraying your actions as part of a bigger solution, but it's solvable, and you want change to be possible. So on the next slide, we have 3 examples of different communication methods, and it'd be great if you could vote on the one that you think helps businesses understand research. They're very different examples. So we have one about the oceans and relating it to parts of the body. We have one that is an infographic on the threats to the ocean. And we have the third one, which is the paper, the research paper, that the other 2 are largely based off. So if we can get a poll going and people could vote, I'll give everyone a minute.
The poll is live and we're getting some answers. So let's see in a minute. I think everyone's just taking a good look at the 3 options. Okay, we've got 3 of you who voted. And if the others could vote as well. Maybe it helps not to look at it for too long, but just to vote on what you think, you know, at a glance, really gets the message across to you.
Okay, should we just...
Okay, so we've got answers coming in for all 3, really, or votes coming in for all 3.
That is good news, because the answer is actually all 3 of them.
In the poll and share the results. There you go. So B, 1 person each on A and C. So
that is perfect, really. I mean, fundamentally, the answer is all 3 of them have very valuable messages in terms of communications. But B is, I think, probably the most common way of making your research a little bit more interactive, is this infographic, bright, bold, key facts kind of way of portraying your research. So it is a great way to start getting your research understood in almost like bite-sized bits. A is an example which takes a very large problem, so the ocean, which a lot of people know of, or in a wide context, and then puts it into a body. So you can start talking about the ocean in terms of a really relatable human factor, in terms of the interconnectivity and the dependence of the ocean on different areas. So again, just turning your research into something that people can relate to. And then C is obviously your traditional research paper, and we're not trying to say that these aren't valuable in any way, because they have so much detail in them. They are so fundamental to research that they are a great way to get your research understood. but in terms of technical language and getting businesses, particularly time-limited decision makers, engaged, they may not have the time to read the paper. So putting it into one of the other two examples is going to be really valuable. The next slide is just an A or B, and this goes back to some of the messaging. So there are 2 sentences, and which one do you believe is more motivating? So which one is the other businesses going to prefer using? So if you were going to email a business, which sentence would you be more likely to get engagement with? And again, I'll give you a couple of minutes. They're very simple examples, I'm aware of that. It's quite hard to write these examples.
But it's actually a tough decision between the two, I feel. Oh, and other people feel as well. We've got answers for both. Or votes for both, rather. Okay, I'll give a few, 30 seconds more for everyone to send in their answers.
Okay.
Okay, well, I think that's almost everyone. Let me end it there and
So
share
what
the
have
results.
we got? B, yeah. So both of these again are fine sentences to show research. Your A is more likely to be your big media headline to get almost society involved, because it's quite emotional. Nobody really wants to think of animals as being fully extinct. But businesses, on the other term, in terms of motivation, they want to know that it's possible to overcome something. So your B example, that koalas have been hard hit by Australian bushfires, and these conservationists are working to come up with a plan for how to help save them, is much more motivating, uplifting, and actually gives the business a chance to turn around and say, we can do something about that. We can get involved with these conservationists. Let's see how we can go forward with this. Whereas A, it's so almost last minute, you're saying that it's now too late for the businesses to do anything. So then it gets pushed to the side. And again, it may not have the same impact or engagement level that you want for your research. The last poll that we have is on infrastructure projects, so maybe slightly closer to home for DCPs in terms of Australian koalas. So again, we've got 2 examples. Which one would you be more likely to use if you were going to contact a business for an infrastructure development?
Now you've got people who've swung clearly in one direction. So well done, Kim. Okay, let's go a few seconds more. And it's also okay to sort of challenge some of this and say,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if you do feel that, okay, I'm going to end the poll now because it's clearly in one direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, but is there anyone who would sort of challenge that maybe and say, actually, A might work better than B in my context? We can ask a bit later as well.
Yeah, I think a couple of slides time, and I've got a couple of an area for breakout. But yeah, in terms of this again, it goes back to everything I've said so far. I'm just going to repeat myself again, but in terms of showing that there is a way forward and there is a way that your research can help, just helps open that engagement a little bit further instead of just shutting it down straight off. So well done everyone who voted B. Now, I do know that they were simple solutions, they were very simple polls, but hopefully it's beginning to show how language can change how you interact with it and how you can get a business to pick up your research in terms of looking at a way forward and working with you instead of dismissing it as a lost cause. So let's start getting slightly more into the business sphere. So ESG teams are your environmental, social and governance teams that sit within companies, but not all companies will have them yet. I think they're becoming slightly more commonplace, and please let us know your experience of ESG teams, particularly in different countries around the world. But typically, ESG teams sit in the company and have either one of two roles or both. They either have a due diligence role where they make sure that their company is meeting the regulations set above and legislations of the country, or they're there to drive forward policies. So if that company has a particular value on biodiversity, then it will be part of their role to drive that into the policies and decision-making process of that company. So they can be a really important area for your research. Obviously, a lot of the companies, they'll have both. They'll be making sure that the company matches the regulations, but also trying to drive forward carbon neutral policies or biodiversity policies, or a particular area that that company is invested in. So as we've seen through most of this training process, every company has its dependencies and impacts on the environment in some way, even if it's just office waste. But the ESG teams have this core responsibility to manage the sustainability issues, particularly in terms of environment. And I think it's at the moment, environmental teams is largely your carbon and climate areas, and sometimes biodiversity isn't as well focused on in ESG teams. But in terms of the issues that they're starting to look at, biodiversity would be a great way to get into this ESG team environment. And this external communication and the information and data that we've spoken about earlier in this talk is really important to ESG teams in terms of getting the communication wider into the companies, almost like their infrastructure, their policy making, their decision making process. The more information the ESG teams can get from your research, the better. So they can be a really important ally to your research and are quite often the first port of call to get your research taken up by a company. So it can be really helpful to start building a good relationship with the ESG team in a company. And you'll be able to see if they have them from their websites, or if you contact their admin@company.com, their generic email address, they should be able to point you in the direction of the ESG teams, and that would really help you build your relationship with the ESG teams. As we said, not every company has an ESG team, but they are slowly becoming more important, particularly as regulations become more and more invested in environmental issues. So lots of companies are building up their environmental capacity in terms of expertise and hiring specific people to deal with the problems. And then here are the circles we spoke about earlier. We need to recognize that there are trade-offs. So particularly in ESG teams where you have their role and they're quite often small teams, quite under-resourced, they might have trade-offs between their environmental, society and government's policies that they have to work out which one they're going to pick up. So if your research is able to demonstrate that it sits in this collective approach, so in this central area of the Venn diagram, then you are helping them you're helping them not have to decide the trade-off. If you can show that your research is benefiting both the environment and a particular community involved, or it helps address climate and biodiversity, and it meets the regulations in terms of what your research is addressing, you can just start to show how the wider implications of your research help address all their problems, and they can start integrating it in more of a collective approach in terms of a holistic and overall approach that they're going to have to be going through. So they are often in this really challenging position of having to decide whether they are going to focus on climate or community or health of the community. So I wouldn't want to be in their position a lot of the time because of these trade-offs, and I think they're really hard decisions to make. And if your research is able to help them address more than one, it will just help them in so many ways that they are more likely to engage with your research. And as we said, they're often also time limited and under-resourced, but they probably will have personal investments too. So if you can start to get to know them and build this relationship and two-way dialogue with these teams, then you can start to understand what they need from you. Are they time limited that they can't read papers and just need you to send them key messages every month, or do they have the time to actually invest in your research and come to meetings and help you develop it? This relationship between the different teams is going to be really important to just getting your research into the company's door in the first place, and then hopefully it will build its way up into the policies to the CEO level. So challenges, and I've lost ability to change slide. Okay. Challenges and opportunities. And again, I would love to know your experiences, because I'm sure there are other challenges that you guys have come across when you're trying to talk to businesses about your research. But these are historically the largest challenges. So this idea of the lack of existing communication between researchers and decision makers, where there isn't a dialogue, and a lot of the time papers and biodiversity in particular isn't picked up by business. So you need to be reaching out in a way that they can actually interact and see your research. You need to be visible in their sphere. And also the timeliness for research. Often, PhDs are years and years in works to get a paper and really develop really fine detailed research. But a lot of business, their timelines are on a much shorter scale than that. So they might have monthly deadlines. They might have 3-5 year targets that they have to meet. So making sure that your research aligns with their timelines is going to be really important as well. Even if it's not a complete research project at that stage, just letting them know the preliminary results and getting them engaged with the conversation of your starting results. And then this attitude of uncertain and conflicting findings. We see this quite a lot, where different views from different people start to conflict each other. And you just have to be aware that that's going to be happening, and making yourself stand out and showing how robust your research is will help just get this open, trusting relationship to remove that attitude towards researchers. And then we've got the different institutional measures of excellence, which is a bit of a mouthful to say now I've said it out loud. But the measuring of excellence will be very different in different companies. So one might be an economic target, and they might be valuing their institution based on how much profit they make, or how much biodiversity land they save that year. Whereas your research will be different, and particularly in the academic sphere, you often get these papers and peer-reviewed excellence and getting it into different journals. So just being aware that the standards and approaches and particularly measures for excellence will be different. And then the last one I think is really important in terms of job instability and turnover. So we talked about the ESG teams and building a relationship, but in terms of an individual person, they may not be there the whole time. So you have to be aware that when you're communicating, you want your research to go towards a team rather than an individual, because if that individual was to leave or get a new job somewhere else, then you don't want the positive impact you've been having so far to be lost. So just being aware that people do leave jobs and changing, and you may have a fantastic relationship with, I don't know, the manager of the ESG team, but then they move on. So then you have to start targeting someone else. And just having the relationship with multiple people in an organization would be really valuable in terms of not losing the impact that you've already had so far through your relationship. I don't know, I might pause there and see if anyone else has any challenges they'd like to add to this that they've identified. I'm not sure if I can see the chat box when I'm presenting.
I think if you go to the sort of hover near the top of your screen,
Yeah.
some of those options there, you should be able to pull up the chat box, Kim. But there hasn't been any comments that have come in so far through chat.
Okay, that's okay.
But
We can keep going and address it later on.
yeah, sure. And also encourage people to start sending things in now through chat if they've got ideas.
Yeah, that would be great. So business language, we've got a couple of examples on the next couple of screens of different ways to communicate. And I know that I think in a couple of sessions, or maybe even next week, you have a session on writing policy briefs, which are your short, condensed versions, particularly focused for policymakers and decision makers. And the same principles that you'll have in that session will apply here in terms of summarizing your research for impact. And I'm sure most of you will have noticed that you get these executive summaries that come up at the top of reports. And these are short, condensed key message boxes a lot of the time. That for time-limited decision makers, they can look just at this one-page review and decide, firstly, if they want to read on and how relevant it is, but also get the key messages very quickly. So it can be really hard to write these because obviously, as the researcher, everything that you do is really interesting and will have an impact, which is where targeting your audience and knowing what key messages you need to get them to understand really becomes important, because writing these key message boxes, particularly summaries and high level findings, you want to pick the ones that are relevant to that particular company. So your findings may be very different if you have a mining company as to an infrastructure company. So just understanding where you want to influence, and going back to the start of this slide, where you're going to target is really important when you're writing these key messages. Your company specific data, if you can do that, it makes it really relevant to that business. So if you can drill down into the areas that they are particularly going to impact in terms of biodiversity, or highlight their key dependencies, this is going to really help them become invested in your research. And then this idea of infographics and images. So everyone, I think when we did the polls earlier, the really visual communication of facts is a very quick way of getting your research understood and engaged with, because it looks attractive and we all like looking at colours basically. So here we've got an example from Proteus, which is a partnership in WCMC. And you can see this key message box that they've come up with. And because of the short bullet points, the summary paragraph, and the image that they've put on this slide, it's a very quick way of getting research impacts. I think this one was on satellite data and the use of remote sensing. You can just start to communicate your key messages very quickly. Alternatively, in this example, you have a very different way of communicating, but equally as effective, because you've got big, bold colours and very bite-sized bits of key facts and communications. So this infographic was particularly in regards to company finances and some of the key decisions and partnerships going on. So it's very different communication in terms of what you're trying to communicate, but here I'm just showing different ways more than the content of these examples. So just showing that you can do it in very different ways, and becoming a salesperson for your research. So making it look attractive, being very enthusiastic yourself, and determining how you can particularly help the business are going to be important. And these different ways, so the key messages, the executive summaries, the policy briefs that you'll be writing, are just really good ways to summarize how you want to get across your research, and picking out the bits that are important to them. And then again, we've touched on this briefly before, but in terms of business language, what helps them set and implement their sustainability commitments. So in businesses, you have economics as a key driver in terms of their profit and benefits that they're going to take away. And this comes in the form of natural capital or cost benefit analysis, which I think, again, I think you're doing some of this later on, and you may have touched on this before, but putting a value on ecosystems that they can understand in terms of monetary values or qualitative or quantitative values. That is really hard to do, and there's so much going on at the moment in the biodiversity sphere of trying to value biodiversity in terms that business, particularly financially, can understand, is really going to help them set and implement their commitments, because it puts it into a very business language. Again, we've got impact messages, so their key areas and their recognition of their values, these short statements that they can put out on social media or on their company websites. This really helps them to set commitments and targets for themselves that you can start to address and say, my research is going to help you meet your impact statement that you released this year. And then again, we spoke about this earlier, but this risk language in terms of getting businesses to realize their impacts and dependencies and the risk that can have on their businesses, particularly in the links to biodiversity. And a lot of the time it's done with climate change at the moment, and that can be really valuable. So biodiversity is becoming almost the new center focus as climate change becomes more invested and integrated into it. So businesses are already familiar with trying to take climate change into their decision makers, or should be getting familiar, and using a similar type of language that you've been talking about with climate in terms of the risks to the business for biodiversity is just a really good way to get them engaged quite early on. You also have your operational risks. So what impact is the biodiversity going to have on the operations of their business, and their reputational, because I think increasingly civil society is becoming involved in the biodiversity conversation, I suppose, in terms of how it's beneficial to a lot of society as a whole. So the companies always want to protect their reputation if they can. So if you can start to get a risk to their reputation spoken about in terms of their impacts, and this can just really help businesses engage. And all of them, financial, operation and reputational, are all risk languages that they can understand. And then you have to make yourself stand out in a particular way to get engaged in the first place, and understanding their values and key messages and how your research works with them, and aligning your message with their message. So you can start to do this by knowing particularly the company you are targeting. So they'll have websites and annual reports that you can start to look at to understand their values and what they have committed to. And if you can do this and then start to show how your research helps them meet their targets, that is a great way to get businesses involved, because they will take all the help they can get, particularly if it's cost effective for them. So again, reading recent release statements or contacting the individuals and teams to get involved in this is just a great way of getting your language to match their language. If they talk about biodiversity in terms of economics, then if you can also show your research helps in economics, then you're just mirroring their message and helping to align in terms of a communication tool that they can understand. Fundamentally, what we really want to get across in this session is that we want to get businesses engaged and change this one-way information flow to a two-way open dialogue.